She had no idea I knew about the lies, the late nights, the conveniently extended work trips. The phone in my pocket buzzed softly, and I pulled it out, reading the message that popped onto the screen. "It's ready. Let me know when to proceed." I let my finger hover over the screen for a moment before typing back, "Stand by." She doesn't suspect a thing. I took a slow sip of my drink and set the glass down on the table beside me. "You're back earlier than I expected," I said, ignoring her jab. She shrugged, her smile curling into something smug. "The conference wrapped up early. Lucky you, huh?" She leaned against the doorway, her eyes scanning me with thinly veiled contempt. "You didn't just sit here all week, did you? God, I can't imagine what you do when I'm not around." Something about the way she spoke, the sneer in her voice, ignited a spark of anger in my chest. But I stayed calm, composed. I had spent the week preparing for this moment, and I wasn't about to let her ruin it with her petty insults. "You'd be surprised," I said with a small, cryptic smile. Her brow furrowed slightly, just for a moment, before she brushed it off. "Whatever," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "I'm going to unpack. Don't wait up." She turned and walked away, her laughter trailing behind her like a bad perfume. Upstairs, I heard the sound of drawers opening and closing, the rustle of clothes being unpacked. Her voice carried faintly through the house as she spoke to someone on her phone. I strained to hear the conversation, but could only catch bits and pieces. "Yeah, he's still clueless. I know, it's almost pathetic." A pause, followed by a laugh that sent a chill down my spine. "Well, what do you expect? He's always been that way. So predictable." I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening around the phone. Predictable? That's what she thought of me. I rose from my chair, the legs scraping softly against the floor, and made my way to the bottom of the stairs. Her voice grew clearer now, the words sharp and cutting. "I'll call you later," she said, her tone light and flirtatious. "Don't worry, he's just downstairs sulking, or whatever he does. He doesn't have a clue about anything. Never has." For a moment, I just stood there, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me like a physical force. But then I smiled, because while she thought she was untouchable, her little game was about to unravel. An hour later, Samantha reappeared in the kitchen. She was still on her phone, giggling at something as she opened the fridge and poured herself a glass of wine. She didn't even acknowledge me as I leaned casually against the doorway, watching her. "Big plans for the evening?" I asked, keeping my tone light, almost disinterested. She glanced at me over her glass and smirked. "Why? You jealous I might have a life outside of this house?" I ignored the jab and smiled faintly. "Not at all. Just curious." She tilted her head, studying me like I was some sort of puzzle she couldn't quite figure out. "You're being weird," she said finally. "Is this about me being gone all week? God, you're so needy sometimes." I chuckled, a low, quiet sound. "Not at all. I had plenty to keep me busy while you were gone." Something in my voice must have caught her attention because her smirk faltered slightly. She set the glass down on the counter and crossed her arms, suddenly defensive. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said smoothly, stepping further into the room. "Just that I finally had time to take care of a few loose ends." Her eyes narrowed, the first flicker of unease crossing her face. "You're acting strange," she said, her voice sharp. "What are you trying to say?" I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. "Relax, Samantha. You're always so quick to jump to conclusions." Her phone buzzed on the counter, drawing her attention. She grabbed it quickly, glancing at the screen. I saw the faint flush of color rise in her cheeks, a telltale sign that whoever was texting her wasn't someone she wanted me to know about. "Something important?" I asked, my tone laced with just enough curiosity to make her bristle. "It's work," she said curtly, turning away from me as she tapped out a reply. "Of course it is," I said softly, more to myself than to her. She turned back to face me, her eyes flashing. "What's that supposed to mean?" I met her gaze, calm and unflinching. "Nothing," I said again, my smile widening ever so slightly. "You're just so dedicated to your job. It's admirable, really." She stared at me for a moment, as if trying to gauge whether I was mocking her. Then she shook her head and grabbed her wine, muttering something under her breath as she stalked out of the room. I watched her go, the smirk slipping from my face as soon as she was out of sight. It was almost too easy, baiting her like that, but I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I pulled out my phone and typed another message. She's starting to get nervous. Be ready. The reply came almost instantly. Understood. The next morning, Samantha was up earlier than usual. I could hear her in the bathroom, the hiss of the shower, and the rhythmic hum of her favorite song. She always sang when she was in a good mood, like nothing in the world could touch her. It grated on me now more than ever. I brewed coffee in the kitchen, pouring 2 cups. I took one black, the way I liked it, and left the other on the counter for her. A gesture she would probably ignore, as she often did. She came downstairs a few minutes later, freshly dressed and glowing with that infuriating air of confidence. Coffee? She asked, eyeing the cup. Made it just for you, I replied. She gave me a skeptical look, like she was trying to decide whether there was some ulterior motive behind the gesture. Thanks, she said after a moment, picking up the cup. She took a sip, her eyes never leaving mine. Big day? I asked, nodding toward her neatly pressed blouse and tailored pants. She rolled her eyes, setting the cup down. Not really. Just meetings, and more meetings. She paused, her tone shifting to something almost smug. Why? You worried I won't be home for dinner? I smiled faintly. Not at all. Just making conversation. She shrugged and grabbed her bag, her phone already in her hand as she typed something quickly. Don't wait up, she said breezily, slipping on her heels and heading for the door. I watched her go, the sound of the door clicking shut, sending a wave of satisfaction through me. She had no idea what was waiting for her. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. Everything's set, I said. The voice on the other end was calm, almost detached. You sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back. I leaned back against the counter, letting the tension bleed out of me. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The man didn't respond for a moment, and then he said, All right, I'll be in touch when it's done. The line went dead, and I set the phone down on the counter, a sense of grim determination settling over me. Today would mark the beginning of the end, for her, and for everything she thought she controlled. By mid-afternoon, I'd received the first update. It was a single text message, short and to the point. She met him at the hotel, room 214. I stared at the screen, my pulse steady and calm. I wasn't surprised. Samantha was as predictable as ever, clinging to her delusions of secrecy. She had no idea how closely I'd been watching her, how deeply I'd dug into her carefully constructed lies. I pulled up the hotel's reservation system on my laptop, a little trick I'd learned during my weeks of preparation. It was astonishing how easy it was to gain access to things when you were willing to get your hands dirty. A few keystrokes later, I found what I was looking for, the reservation under her co-worker's name. 1 night only. Standard room. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. I had everything I needed now. The text messages I'd intercepted between Samantha and her lover were damning enough. But this was the nail in the coffin. I forwarded the hotel confirmation to my lawyer, attaching the screenshots of her texts for good measure. The divorce papers would be ready soon. But this wasn't just about ending our marriage. This was about ensuring she left with nothing. As I sat there, my phone buzzed again. Another message, this time accompanied by a photo. Samantha stepping out of her car, her sunglasses perched on her nose, and her co-worker waiting by the hotel entrance with a sly grin. I stared at the image for a long moment, my fingers tightening around the phone. There she was, laughing, carefree, completely oblivious to the storm about to hit her. I sent a reply, keep watching. Let me know when she leaves. The response came back quickly, will do. Satisfied, I closed the laptop and went to pour myself another drink. The wheels were in motion now, and there was no stopping what was coming. Later that evening, Samantha returned home, her heels clicking against the floor as she walked into the living room. She seemed almost giddy, her mood light and effervescent. Something funny? I asked, my voice neutral as I sat on the couch, pretending to watch TV. She waved a hand dismissively. Just a great day at work, that's all. You wouldn't understand. I raised an eyebrow, glancing at her. Try me. She laughed, shaking her head. Oh, please. You're always so uptight. It's like you don't know how to have fun. I smiled faintly, sipping my drink. Maybe you're right, but I think I'm starting to figure it out. Her laugh faltered slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied me. You're acting weird again. I shrugged, leaning back into the couch. Maybe I've just had a good day too. She scoffed, brushing past me toward the kitchen. Whatever. Just try not to ruin my mood. As I listened to her rummage through the fridge, I felt a cold, calculated satisfaction settle over me. Her mood wouldn't last much longer. The following morning, Samantha seemed distracted. Her usual smug confidence had dulled, replaced by something more restless. She paced the kitchen as she drank her coffee, glancing at her phone every few seconds. Everything all right? I asked, watching her from the table. She stopped mid-step, blinking at me as though she'd forgotten I was there. What? Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't it be? No reason, I said with a shrug, sipping my coffee. You just seem tense. She shot me a sharp look, but didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her bag and phone, muttering something about running late for work. Her heels clicked hurriedly as she made her way to the door. Have a good day, I called after her. She didn't respond, slamming the door shut behind her. I smiled to myself. The first seeds of doubt had been planted. She didn't know it yet, but her carefully constructed world was already starting to crumble. By mid-afternoon, the plan was fully in motion. My phone buzzed with another update. She's nervous. Keeps checking her phone. He's been texting her nonstop. Good. The more rattled she was, the more mistakes she'd make. I texted back. Perfect. Keep her distracted. Next, I made a call to my lawyer. We went over the final details of the divorce papers, how I'd ensured they left her with nothing. The evidence I'd gathered over the past few weeks was more than enough to secure my position. Are you sure you want to go through with this? My lawyer asked, his tone cautious. I've never been more sure of anything, I said calmly. All right. The papers will be ready by tomorrow morning. Good, I said, my voice cold. And make sure they're delivered in person. That evening, Samantha came home later than usual. She was visibly frazzled, her hair slightly disheveled, her usually pristine makeup smudged. She dropped her bag on the floor and collapsed onto the couch, letting out a long, frustrated sigh. Rough day? I asked, feigning concern. She shot me a glare. You have no idea. I tilted my head, watching her closely. Maybe you should talk about it. You know, get it off your chest. She let out a bitter laugh. Like you'd care. I smiled faintly. You'd be surprised. She stared at me for a moment, something flickering in her eyes. Was it suspicion? Or just the weight of her own guilt? Either way, she shook her head and muttered, I'm going to bed. As she disappeared up the stairs, I pulled out my phone and typed a final message for the day. Everything is ready. Tomorrow, we move. The reply came swiftly. Understood. I set the phone down, leaning back in my chair as a wave of cold satisfaction washed over me. She wouldn't see it coming. Not until it was too late. The next morning, Samantha woke up to an empty house. I'd made sure to leave before she was even out of bed, just to keep her on edge. As I drove to my first destination, my phone buzzed with confirmation. The divorce papers had been delivered to her office, signed and sealed. By now, she would be sitting at her desk, opening the envelope with a smug assumption that it was some minor document requiring her attention. She wouldn't expect to see her entire life laid out in black and white, proof of her infidelity, her lies, and my intention to strip her of everything she thought she could take from me. I'd hired someone to capture the moment. A courier who wasn't just there to deliver papers, but to observe her reaction. Within an hour, I had a text. She's panicked. Left the office immediately. Looked like she was about to cry. I smiled, gripping the steering wheel tighter. It was only the beginning. I spent the afternoon carefully executing the next steps. The private investigator I'd hired weeks ago had already gathered more than enough evidence, but there were still loose ends to tie up. Namely, ensuring her lover got a taste of the chaos too. The man she'd been seeing was as arrogant as she was, a smug executive who thought his position made him untouchable. What Samantha didn't know was that I'd tracked him down. His workplace, his wife, and even the private school his kids attended. By evening, the first domino had fallen. A package had been sent to his wife, filled with photos, text screenshots, and receipts for hotel stays. The PI had delivered it personally, ensuring the impact was immediate. My phone buzzed again. Package received. Wife called him at work. Major fallout. I imagined the chaos unfolding, the cracks splintering through his picture-perfect world. He'd thought he could play games, but he wasn't ready for someone like me. When I returned home, Samantha was already there, pacing the living room like a caged animal. The divorce papers were scattered across the coffee table, and she looked up at me with wide, desperate eyes as I stepped inside. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, waving the papers at me. I closed the door behind me, setting my keys on the counter with deliberate calm. "What does it look like? You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising. "You're filing for divorce? Are you insane?" I walked past her, ignoring her frantic energy as I poured myself a glass of water. "I'm completely serious, Samantha. This marriage is over." Her hands trembled as she clutched the papers, her voice breaking. "You can't just end things like this. What about everything we've built together?" I turned to face her, my expression cold and unyielding. "Everything we built? You mean the lies, the betrayal, the months you spent humiliating me behind my back? That's what you're clinging to." Her face twisted into a mixture of panic and anger. "This is ridiculous. You're blowing everything out of proportion. It was nothing. Just a mistake. Don't." I cut her off sharply. "Don't insult me with more lies. I know everything, Samantha. Every single detail. And I'm done pretending this marriage is worth saving." She stared at me, her confidence crumbling as the reality of the situation began to sink in. For the first time, she seemed truly afraid. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, her voice trembling. "We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." I took a step closer, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. "You already made your choice, Samantha. Now, you'll live with the consequences." Her breath hitched, and for the first time in years, she looked completely powerless. Samantha sat down heavily on the couch, her face pale as she stared at the divorce papers. The weight of her predicament was finally beginning to register. I stood across the room, watching her with a cold detachment that seemed to rattle her even further. "You don't understand," she said after a long silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't just do this to me." I raised an eyebrow. "Do this to you? Tell me, Samantha, how long did you think you could string me along while sneaking off to your little rendezvous? Did you honestly believe I'd never find out?" Her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing with a flicker of her old defiance. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice sharper now. "You're being paranoid." I laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Still lying, even now? Do you think I don't know about room 214 at the Lancaster Hotel? Or about the text you've been sending him while you were supposedly working late?" Her face drained of color, the smug facade slipping completely. You've been spying on me?" "Spying?" I said, tilting my head. "No, Samantha. Investigating. There's a difference. And what I found was more than enough to make this divorce as painful for you as possible." She stood abruptly, her hands shaking as she jabbed a finger in my direction. "You're insane. This is psychotic. You can't just go snooping into my private life and expect me to." "Private life?" I interrupted, my voice low and deadly. "The moment you brought someone else into our marriage, Samantha, you forfeited any claim to privacy. Don't try to paint yourself as the victim here." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For once, she seemed completely at a loss. An hour later, she locked herself in the bedroom. I could hear her pacing, muttering to herself, likely trying to figure out how to salvage her crumbling world. It wouldn't matter. The damage was already done. While she stewed upstairs, I made another call, this time to her lover's workplace. I'd arranged for an anonymous tip to be sent to HR earlier in the day, complete with photos of him entering and leaving the hotel with Samantha. It wouldn't take much to tarnish his reputation, especially in a company as image-conscious as his. When the call ended, I poured myself a drink and sat by the fire, savoring the quiet. Samantha had spent years treating me like I was insignificant, like I was a fool. Now, the tables had turned. My phone buzzed again. Another update from my PI. He's in trouble at work. HR pulled him into a meeting. Look serious. Good. It wasn't just about ending things with Samantha. It was about ensuring that everyone who had a hand in this betrayal felt the consequences. When Samantha finally came downstairs, her face was a mix of anger and desperation. We need to talk, she said, her voice trembling. Do we? I said, not looking up from my drink. Yes, she snapped, her tone rising. You're not thinking clearly. You can't just destroy everything we've built together over a stupid misunderstanding. I set my glass down and stood, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her take a step back. This isn't a misunderstanding, Samantha. This is the end. And if you think for 1 second that I'll let you walk away from this unscathed, you're delusional. She flinched, her confidence completely shattered. For once, she had nothing to say. The silence between us hung heavy in the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Samantha stood there, her eyes darting around as though searching for some lifeline. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You're serious, she said, as if the realization was just hitting her. I didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of her own words sink in. Then, calmly, I said, dead serious. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. You can't do this to me, she hissed. Do you have any idea what you're setting into motion? You'll ruin my life. I tilted my head slightly, feigning curiosity. Ruin your life? I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue. Samantha, you did that all on your own. All I'm doing is making sure you take responsibility for it. Her breathing quickened, panic flickering in her eyes. I'll fight this, she said, her voice trembling but defiant. You think you can just bulldoze over me, but I'll make sure you regret this. I stepped closer, my expression cold and unyielding. Fight all you want. Every text, every photo, every receipt I have will shred you in court. You cheated, Samantha. You lied. And you'll walk away with nothing because of it. She recoiled, her shoulders slumping slightly. You can't take everything from me, she muttered, though it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself than me. Oh, I can, I said, my voice calm and steady. And I will. Later that evening, Samantha's phone rang. She snatched it off the table, her fingers trembling as she answered. Hello? I could hear the muffled voice on the other end. Her lover, no doubt. She immediately walked into the next room, her voice dropping to a hushed tone. I stayed where I was, sipping my drink as I listened. What do you mean HR got involved? She said, her voice rising. How could they even know? She fell silent, her breathing audible even from the next room. Then, in a furious whisper, she said, This has to be him. He's doing this. He's trying to ruin us. I leaned back in my chair, a satisfied smile creeping across my face. She came back into the living room moments later, her face pale but her eyes burning with anger. You're going after him too? She spat, her voice shaking. Of course, I said simply. Did you think I'd let him walk away untouched? He's just as guilty as you are. Her jaw dropped, her expression a mix of shock and fury. You're unbelievable, she said, her voice trembling. This isn't just about me, is it? You're trying to burn everything to the ground. I met her gaze, unflinching. No, Samantha. I'm just returning the favor. That night, I left her to stew in her own misery, retreating to the guest room. I didn't need to see her to know she was unraveling. The cracks in her armor were widening, and soon, everything she tried so desperately to control would come crashing down. The next morning, Samantha's appearance told me everything I needed to know. Dark circles ringed her eyes, her usually flawless makeup hastily applied, and her once perfectly styled hair hung limp around her face. She was unraveling, and I was savoring every moment of it. She didn't say a word to me as she moved around the kitchen, her movements stiff and robotic. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she snatched it up with shaking hands, reading the message with a growing look of dread. Bad news? I asked casually, not bothering to hide the amusement in my voice. Her head snapped up, and for a moment, she looked like she might hurl the phone at me. Instead, she forced a bitter laugh. You really think you've won, don't you? She spat. I leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip of my coffee. It's not about winning, Samantha. It's about justice. About balance. Balance? She repeated, her voice rising. You call this balance? You're destroying everything. My job, my reputation, my life. I set my mug down and crossed my arms, meeting her glare with calm indifference. You destroyed it the moment you decided to betray me. I'm just making sure the fallout lands where it belongs. She turned away, muttering something under her breath as she grabbed her bag and headed for the door. You'll regret this, she said, her voice trembling with fury. I let out a soft chuckle. We'll see. By midday, I'd received another update from my PI. Samantha's lover had been suspended from his job, pending an investigation. The photos and evidence I'd provided had been enough to shake the company's confidence in him, and his position now hung by a thread. It was only a matter of time before the news spread to his colleagues, his friends, and his family. The carefully crafted image he'd built was crumbling, and I couldn't have planned it better myself. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from my lawyer. The assets are frozen. She won't be able to touch a dime until the divorce is finalized. I smiled, satisfied. Samantha's access to our joint accounts had been cut off. Any money she had squirreled away on her own wouldn't last long, not with her lifestyle. That evening, she came home late, slamming the door behind her. I was sitting in the living room, casually flipping through a book, when she stormed in. You froze the accounts, she said, her voice trembling with barely restrained anger. Of course, I said without looking up. Why would I let you spend my money while you're planning your escape with him? She let out a bitter laugh, pacing the room like a caged animal. You're unbelievable. You think you're so clever, don't you? I finally looked up, meeting her gaze with an icy calm. Not clever, Samantha. Just thorough. And fair, I'd say, considering everything you've done. Her face twisted in frustration, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But instead, she turned and stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. I leaned back in my chair, the faint sound of her muffled cries filtering through the house. It was a sound I'd once have felt compelled to comfort. Now, it was nothing more than the distant echo of her downfall. Samantha barely came out of the bedroom the next morning. I could hear her pacing, talking frantically on her phone, no doubt trying to salvage the last shreds of control over her life. Every so often, snippets of her voice would drift down the stairs. I don't know what to do. He's gone completely insane. Her desperation was palpable. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee and scrolling through emails, content to let her panic. But by mid-morning, she finally emerged, her face a mask of forced calm that didn't fool me for a second. We need to talk, she said, her voice tight. I gestured for her to sit, leaning back in my chair as if this were a business meeting. By all means. She hesitated, clearly caught off guard by my composure, but then squared her shoulders and sat down across from me. This has gone far enough, she said. I don't know what you're trying to prove, but you're taking things too far. I raised an eyebrow, my expression unreadable. Too far, I repeated. Samantha, this is barely the beginning. Her jaw clenched, her composure cracking ever so slightly. You're acting like a vindictive child, she snapped. Do you really think this is going to make you feel better? Ruining me? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Feel better? I said softly. No, Samantha, this isn't about feeling better. It's about justice. It's about making sure you understand the weight of what you've done. She scoffed, crossing her arms. Oh, spare me the lecture. This isn't about justice. This is about you wanting revenge because you can't handle the fact that I moved on. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. Moved on, I said, my tone mocking. Is that what you call sneaking around behind my back? Lying to my face? Laughing at me while you carried on with him? She flinched but quickly recovered, her eyes narrowing. You were never enough for me, she said coldly. That's the truth you don't want to hear. You're boring, predictable. You think being nice and loyal is enough, but it's not. You're nothing. Her words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. But instead of the reaction she wanted, anger, hurt, I simply stared at her, my expression unchanging. That's the difference between us, Samantha, I said after a moment, my voice calm and even. You think words can hurt me, but I've moved past that. Now, I deal in actions. And trust me, my actions will speak far louder than your pathetic attempts to hurt me ever could. Her confidence faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. You're insane, she said, standing abruptly. I don't know who you are anymore. I stood as well, towering over her as I looked down into her panicked eyes. No, Samantha, I said quietly. You never knew me, but you're about to find out exactly who I am. She backed away, retreating toward the stairs, her mask of defiance cracking with every step. You're going to regret this, she said weakly, her voice trembling. I didn't respond. I simply watched as she fled back to the safety of the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. By midday, the house was eerily quiet. Samantha hadn't emerged from the bedroom, but I knew better than to think she was idle. She was likely on her phone, trying to pull the strings of what little influence she still had. But her web of lies was fraying, and I'd made sure there was no escape. I spent the afternoon tying up the final threads of my plan. Samantha's lover, already reeling from his troubles at work, would now face the fallout at home. The private investigator I'd hired sent me one last update. A photo of the man being escorted out of his office, his expression a mix of rage and humiliation. It wasn't enough for me to simply end their affair. I wanted the consequences to ripple outward, to destroy every fragile illusion they had built around themselves. By the time evening rolled around, Samantha came downstairs. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale and drawn. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of her own lies had physically diminished her. We need to stop this, she said, her voice trembling but determined. I'll sign the divorce papers. I'll leave. Just stop whatever it is you're doing. I leaned against the counter, watching her with a detached calm. It's too late for that, Samantha. She blinked, her face twisting in confusion. What do you mean? I said I'll leave. Isn't that what you wanted? I took a slow step toward her, my gaze unwavering. What I wanted was for you to face the consequences of your actions, to understand what it feels like to have your life torn apart. Her lips trembled, and she shook her head. You've made your point, okay? I get it, but you're going too far. You're ruining me. I tilted my head slightly, as if considering her words. And yet, Samantha, I remember the laughter, the smug little looks, the way you dismissed me, mocked me, treated me like I was nothing. Did you ever think about the damage you were doing then? Or did you just assume I'd stay the fool forever? Tears filled her eyes, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear there. I was wrong, she whispered. I made a mistake. But this is cruel. Cruel? I said, my voice hardening. You want to talk about cruelty? Do you know how many nights I stayed awake, wondering why I wasn't enough for you? How many times I blamed myself for your lies? No, Samantha, you don't get to play the victim now. She took a step back, her hands trembling. What do you want from me? I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. I want you to lose everything. The way you made me feel when you thought you could get away with it. That's what I want. Her breath hitched, and she turned, fleeing the room once again.